Okay, so it's Tuesday, October 16th, 2012. I'm at the home of Ann and Alan Bromberg in Dallas, Texas. The following interview is part of the DMA's History of Contemporary Art Collecting in Dallas research project, funded by the Texas Fund for Curatorial Research. I am Leigh, Arnold, project researcher at the DMA, and I will be speaking with Alan and Ann this evening regarding the later days of the Dallas Museum for Contemporary Arts, the merger of the two museums, and both Ann and Alan's continued interest in and support of the arts in Dallas. So thank you both for agreeing to be interviewed as part of this project. I really appreciate it.
It should be interesting.
It should be, that's right. Well, you're both DallasSITES, native DallasSITES, correct? And Ann, you went away for school, undergrad, graduate school, and spent kind of time away from Dallas.
So did Alan.
And that was my question. I was wondering, Alan, did you spend some significant time away from Dallas?
3 years. Good many years. I guess it was 4 years at Harvard and 3 years at Yale. That's where I did my education, and then 2 years in the U.S. Army in Europe.
Oh, wow. Whereabouts in Europe?
I was stationed in Frankfurt. We were spying on the Russians in those days.
Did you get any good, were you a good spy?
I thought it was fairly active, yes.
Did you have a code name?
Yes, but I've long since forgotten it. I was told never to repeat it to them.
When did you two meet? Was it before you both left Dallas, or was it kind of after you return, Alan, and before you leave, Ann?
It was before our parents knew each other.
Yes, let me say, since politics is going to play a significant role in this, that my mother, Dorothy Ruggles, and Alan's mother, Juanita Bromberg, worked together on a number of projects, including helping to found Texas Country Day School, but they also, in later years, were both really worked for the League of Women Voters, which at that time was innovative, energetic for women to support. But the families knew each other, and my older sisters, my 3 sisters were all a lot older, 10 years and more older than I was. But they knew Alan, and you tell them about being in Democratic politics together.
There was a period when there was considerable upheaval at the University of Texas in Austin, and there was a man named Homer Ramey who was under consideration for presidency of the university and eventually ran for governor and was the darling of all the progressives, as we called them in those days. And it was in the period of the McCarthy era hearings. So at the same time there was a pretty strong Democratic presence in politics. There was also a lot of anti-communist propaganda, and it tied in ultimately to what happened at the art museum, where certain artists were labeled as communist and their works were banned or destroyed, taken out of the public eye. So those who had a political interest, it often meshed nicely with our artistic interests, and ultimately were resolved quietly in the merger of the museum. But I've always felt that the enthusiasm for the what became the foundation for the arts and was the Dallas Museum for Contemporary Arts. It was about people that were politically worthy.
Right. That's why I really hero worshipped Alan from the time I was a teenager. Really from the time I was a kid. Here was this liberal Democrat. My father was very conservative and was the editor of the editorial page in the Dallas News in its most conservative era. And Alan and his family were so delightfully non-conservative and intellectual and cultivated and interested in the arts. So I hero worshipped Alan from the time I was very young, and Alan talked me into going to Harvard and encouraged me to do it. And
Best thing I ever did.
anyway, and then from then on, we really never looked back. We've always been good friends, and eventually it matured into something more serious. I also would like to say I completely agree with Alan's view of politics in the 50s and early 60s. I remember my father, who actually was a very intelligent man, don't get me wrong, he really was, despite being conservative. But at some point or another, he said at a party with elderly friends, you know, Harvard turned Anne into a communist. I felt like saying, but did not say, well, it wasn't Harvard, it was my sisters and Alan. If you want to define it, liberal Democrats as being communists.
So maybe it's an overstatement, but people who were liberal in politics tended to be liberal and more adventurous in the arts. It was a nice mesh.
It's true.
Do you have any personal recollections of that period that you mentioned of the communist controversy at the museum in the 50s?
Yes. I don't recall very much in detail. I think the Dallas News was part of it. It provided publicity on the denunciation of a number of the artists as being communists, and there was pressure brought by our worthy citizens on the governors of the city, the city council, to take down some of the paintings or take them off the list at the museum.
Including Picasso.
Yeah.
And Rivera, I believe.
And Rivera.
And Anne, were you in Dallas at that time? Were you aware that was going on?
I didn't come back from Boston till 61. Actually, we married in 59, so the first 2 years we were married, I was commuting between Boston and Dallas, finishing my PhD. But I remember the 50s, even from a distance, very vividly. And those of us who were anti-McCarthy, a friend of mine from Harvard and I went, McCarthy had a hearing in some law court in Boston, and I recollect us going in red coats. That's a statement against McCarthy. But yeah, I do remember that era, although I think it was really Alan's parents and their friends who were more behind the setting up of the Museum for Contemporary Art.
Do you think that had a direct effect, or the DMCA, the founding of the Dallas Museum for Contemporary Arts, was kind of a almost direct result of what happened?
I do, don't you? Well, some of it was that, how shall I put this? The museum, as it had developed up, let's say to 55, the mid-50s, had been really a Texas art museum. And Jerry Bywaters, who was not literally the first director, but the first effective director of the museum, was really interested in Texas art and was a fine Texas artist himself. I mean, Jerry was a very good artist. So that was just what he was interested in. And these are your parents and their friends, but when you say that they wanted to collect more contemporary art,
Considerably more contemporary.
Yeah.
But they were all fans of the local artists, the Bywaters, that the Dallas 8 or 9 or whatever number they bought from the local artists as well as talked about the development of the arts, the need for freedom of that development.
and bigger European contemporary art too.
Mhm.
I mean, Ted, I think you ought to, before you leave, video the sculptures, contemporary sculptures we inherited from Alan's
Sure.
parents, because they'll ultimately go to the museum when we die, but they're very good examples of, how sophisticated that circle of people were and what they collected and why they wanted to found the Museum for Contemporary Art, it seems to me, because they just felt like there wasn't any place for that in the old museum.
So, Alan, we've been mentioning your parents quite a bit, and their role in the founding of the DMCA. And I'm wondering what your level of involvement was, and, what period of your life? Was that your early career as starting out as a lawyer?
Yes. I had recently graduated from Yale with a law degree and then spent my 2 years in the Army and came back
Spine.
happy to merge corporations, which was one of the things that I had always been interested in law school. The process of taking shareholders and their interests and compound them with other shareholders and their interests in other entities and making two entities into one. So I was very much interested in the legal aspects of the merger, as I was in the intellectual interests and the artistic interests of broadening the development that was then under attack in Dallas art interest circles at those days.
But didn't you also do the contract for setting up the Museum for Contemporary Art originally?
Yes, that was one of the things I worked on.
So you saw both the beginning and, in a sense, the end of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you happen to go to openings or exhibitions at the DMCA, or were you more interested in the legal
No,
aspect?
I went to the exhibition. That's what the objective was all about, to get the art into view and look at it broadly and without preconceptions.
Do you have any particular exhibitions that come to mind as standing out to you?
I can't name them specifically. There was one that I particularly enjoyed and tended to see pretty intensely since my mother curated it, which was heavy on the contemporary Germans of that period. And it was a very interesting and attractive exhibit to me.
And by the time you got to Dallas in '61, were you were obviously aware of the DMCA because of your relationship with Alan and his family, but do you have any personal recollections of going to the museum?
Very vaguely, because, as I say, through most of the 50s, 53 to 61, I was, here mostly in the summer. I can remember the Contemporary Museum when it was in the Cedar Springs building. And I remembered the shows, but pretty dimly. I remember the exhibits in the 60s at the Merge Museum much more clearly, because I was back living here. And
Right.
I gave lectures at the museum and things like that. So I don't remember the Contemporary Art Museum as well as Alan does. The only thing I really do remember in that panel that Margaret McDermott essentially led, I assume you all went to that.
I watched it.
On
yeah.
donors, yeah. She obviously remembered the interplay between the characters involved in the murder. I remember that. I remember the supporters of both the old museum, including Margaret G. McDermott, and Alan's parents' friends, the Kahns and the Marcuses and so on. You know, going over there for drinks and dinner and sitting around in the living room talking about, seriously arguing about should the merger take place. That's really my first sort of strong memory, is the people involved, most of whom were part of Alan's parents' circle of friends, talking about it. Is that the way you remember it?
Yes.
That's why I suggested you try to photograph the Bromberg house, now the Patterson house, because even though the Pattersons obviously changed the way everything in it, the house still looks remarkably the way it did when Cookie and Alfred lived there. And all those people were discussing, do we want one museum or two museums? And even more to the point, can Dallas afford two museums, which is a serious point. Would you say it was fair to say that the actual demise of the Museum for Contemporary Art and the merger was because the Contemporary Art Museum had really run out of money and big supporters?
That was a big factor.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think you've got to be realistic about that. It wasn't idealized, it was pretty gut economics.
You know, all those early years were preoccupied with where the museum would be and how it could be financed.
Yeah.
I noticed in going through some of the board minutes, and even some of your own handwritten notes, Alan, from executive committee meetings, that very early on there was talk of a merger, almost as early as before they even moved to the Cedar Springs location. And I was surprised by that, but I read in the notes that there were several people that part of the talk of the merger was to get the DMFA out of Fair Park, and it was using the Dallas Museum for Contemporary Arts as kind of a way to say, we have this location here, can you move out of Fair Park? And I was wondering, has that been an issue for so long? I didn't realize Fair Park as a location for the museum.
Actually, I thought about that too, because I reread the section in Jerry Bywater's book, 75 Years of the Dallas Art Association, about the merger, and he says that building a new museum somewhere else, you know, was something that was a power. I hadn't remembered that, did you?
Yes.
And it didn't happen. See, when you're older than I am, closer to it. I had no idea that that was a significant thing at the time, and it didn't actually happen till Harry Parker in the 70s and early 80s. But I hadn't realized that people were agitating for a new museum, and that also explains, which you can read about in Jerry's book, why Merrill Rupel, when he succeeded Jerry, built the addition to the old museum and remodeled it. And I do remember a lot of our architect friends bitching about, you know, what tacky things you're doing to this wonderful museum in Fair Park. But you know, architects are picky.
Yeah. So
I didn't remember any of that. Apparently you do. You did.
I remember a considerable amount of it.
That's interesting.
Because it was a very negative location. Even those who admired the state fair and went annually vigorously to the fair felt that it was a slum area of the city and it was not a place for proper people to go.
Well, the plain cold fact is that's true. It still is a slum area, and it's still true that it gets lots of people during the fair, and it's hard to get people the rest of the year. I can remember when the big show of the year at DMFA had to be during the fair, because that's when you had
To
night.
get people.
No question about that.
So that had its dimension of political, also people who were more democratic, as they like to think of it, thought it was more important to have a museum where everybody would be welcome and would find it easy to go.
I also noticed on the merger ballot for the DMCA that there were 2 other options, I think, or 3 other options. And one of them was to move to SMU. And I think even Ray Nasher had offered space at North Park. But Alan, maybe you can fill us in on some of these alternatives to the merger that were just kind of alternatives and never really considered very seriously.
There was discussion, somewhat desperate discussion, to find a way out of Fair Park. But SMU wouldn't permit alcohol to be served at whatever facility it was willing to provide. And that was a death blow for the more alcoholic members of the board. And I don't think SMU ever really embraced the merger as an intellectual operation, as part of it. I think it was looked at more as the part of the art department teaching painting, rather than more than art as a cultural development and its relation to music and theater.
That is absolutely true. Having started to teach at SMU in the art department, in quotation marks, when I got back. And I did that for like 3 or 4 years, and it might as well not have happened. There wasn't an art history department. Alan is absolutely right. There was a big studio department, studio art department, which in fact has produced a number of very fine artists. You know, I'm not knocking SMU studio art program, but that's what it was. And music and theater were very active, but art history might as well not have existed. And I tried it for 4 years, and I thought, this is just, well, I mean, the proof of that is the last year they asked me to teach Latin literature, which I was perfectly competent to teach. And I love Latin literature, but that wasn't exactly what I had thought I was going to do at SMU. And there was nobody really, basically. I mean, you wouldn't, it's unrecognizable now, and they have quite a good art history department, but that's what it was like in the 60s.
And so Alan, we just mentioned that you drafted both the setting up of the DMCA and the merger document. Were you working with board members on kind of the direction of where they wanted the merger to go and the stipulations that the DMCA
I think so.
had?
I don't remember it in much detail. The board members that I were closest to, trying to recall which of them were. Unfortunately, I can't pull names out very readily.
Steve Kahn?
Steve was a very enthusiastic supporter of the museum. And I think he was one of the people that was able to gather some money, which was part of a significant element. in the museum. Eddie Marcus was much involved in that. And Mr. Purnell from the DNA traditional board, and he was involved in the legal aspects and efforts to raise money. But there was very little money available for the cultural development of the city in those days.
Betty Blake?
Betty was involved. I don't think she was involved in the negotiations. I think she was involved in trying to persuade some of her richer friends to make contributions. And
That's
I no longer
interesting.
recall what sort of budget we had put together. There was a great deal of effort to figure out what would this cost, given where would we find the space and what would we need for an operating budget. So there was a lot of throwing up of hands when it appeared that there were very few solutions, and it took death bequest to create the first fund to make the museum operable, functional. And it's been pretty easy for the museum to raise money in subsequent years. Not terribly easy, but it's a very different period now than it was in the 1950s and 60s.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm reading a lot of board minutes and I'm trying to imagine what those meetings were like, if they were full of emotion, if things got heated, or if they were very polite. And I'm wondering if you can talk about those kind of closed doors meetings that were discussing the merger.
As nearly as I can recall, they were polite, but forcefully presented by both sides. So I think everybody, once it reached the point that there were good reasons to have a unified museum, people found ways to maneuver within that.
Who was pushing the merger from the DMFA side?
Mm-hmm.
I have actually no idea who did.
I wish I could tell you that. I don't think I have an easy answer.
Because it was pretty clear to me from the donor panel discussion that it didn't sound to me like people who had been involved with the MFA for a long time before the merger were particularly pushing the merger.
No, I mean, they would have had to give up their director. They would have had to kind of concede.
And join the boards and everything,
yeah,
but
so.
I certainly can't remember
I think that was,
who was pushing it from that end.
if it's going to happen, because it will be good for the city.
And Dallas couldn't
We'll
afford
about it.
2 museums. I do think that a lot of people that supported the older museum must have felt it's gotta be good to just have one museum
Mhm.
rather than frittering money and energy
Well,
on
that
2
kind of
museums. Do you think they felt that way?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
that's-
almost bound to be true.
That attitude almost shows how important the DMCA had become at that point. Because if this was
A rival,
just,
you mean.
exactly,
Yeah,
this wasn't
yeah.
just some museum doing shows that
Yeah.
nobody was showing up to. They had a true rival with this museum, so
Yeah.
that's interesting that it was in such a short amount of time, they were able to accomplish so much. Alan, do you remember if there were any members of the board on the DMCA who were more vocal, either for or against the merger?
I'd probably have to dig into my notes to come up with that.
Mm-hmm. I picture meetings of people just throwing their fists in the air saying, no, we cannot merge, but I have a feeling it was a lot more polite than that.
I think it was, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was a sense of inevitably developing over time as the discussions went along. Some people who must have said, we're tired of hearing this, but let's go ahead and pull together a plan and take it from on.
Mm-hmm.
And the money must surely have been
Yes.
decisive, and losing the building and McKagey leaving, did they really have an option?
Yeah.
Pretty well. On either side.
Did either of you get to know Douglas McKagey during his tenure as the director there?
I have his desk.
Really?
Mhm.
What's the story there?
When he retired, the museum moved to Fair Park. I said, I'd like to buy Douglas McKagey's desk. And it was given to me for the work I had done on the merger.
Seems
So
like
if you
a
come
good-
to my office at SMU, I sit behind Douglas McKagey's desk.
Love it.
That's pretty neat. What was Douglas McKagey like?
Crisp. He was a talkative guy, very interested, somewhat abstract in his discussion, very vocal about what people were and weren't doing. But you probably talked to him more than I did on cultural grounds.
Not really, but that's the way I listened to him. He tended to talk rather than discuss. And I always just come back to Dallas, what would I say to this bright guy? But he was very bright. I mean, that really came over. He had a very smart mind, and Alan's right, he articulated things clearly, and he had a vision, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
And he was very good with artists, from what I understand.
Mm-hmm. I think that's
Local
true.
artists and
Mhm.
some of the gentlemen that were volunteering at the DMCA, like Roger Winter has spoken very highly of
Yeah.
him, and David McManaway and some of those, Hal Pauley and Herb Regala. So there was a sense of camaraderie between those artists and the staff members like Janet Kleinman and Kuttner.
It was, yes.
And I'm wondering, I know that McKagey and Paul Baker got along quite well.
Yeah.
When did you begin your work at the
Well, I
Dallas
didn't
Theater
go to
Center?
work for the theater center till 67, 68. Alan has clearly spent his life helping Dallas cultural organizations. Alan also helped establish the theater center.
Ah.
And that's something else, we share a passion for theater. But anyway, and was a friend of Paul's,
Mhm.
and interested in, the theater center getting going. And at the point at which I got fed up with SMU and decided to resign because there was really nothing for me to do. I don't even remember who suggested it, but Paul Baker asked me if I wanted to teach theater history, because at that point the Theater Center offered a graduate degree in theater for Trinity University in San Antonio.
Wow.
And Trinity, which is quite a hotshot school, said you have to have academically respectable courses. And he thought I would be able to provide academically respectable courses. So I thought, well, be interesting to try. I'll see. So I tried it, and I just loved it. It was really fun. Baker was a wonderful man, wouldn't you say, honey?
Very.
He was just so creative and so imaginative. I mean, he was just like, to be frank, night and day compared to the people running SMU. I mean, it was just, you know, he was an artist himself. It's not surprising that actual artists liked him. And he had this very imaginative view about integrating people's creative abilities. Everybody, whether you were designing sets or acting or doing music for a play or teaching theater history like me, he always wanted you to do something really imaginative. And the people he got were top notch, the students. And it was just a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. It's a great way to spend one's young and enthusiastic years. It was great. It may be unconventional, but have been unconventional, but it certainly was fun. So that was inspiring. And I did at the same time also give lectures at the art museum, you know, a lot.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about the art museum after it was merged. I'm curious, immediately following the merging of the two museums, what the atmosphere like was at the museum, but also if there was any, did the community recognize it, or did the community respond in any way? What the atmosphere was like in Dallas immediately following the merger?
Well, that,
Say the community was quietly uninterested.
yeah.
It was
Also, it was Merrill's regime that, for whatever that was worth.
But it was a period of somewhat growing coverage by the newspaper. So you knew a little bit more after the merger about what was going on in art circles. And there was some activity in art circles apart from the museum, the galleries and the local painters. And I think the merger called some attention to their activities and was beneficial for them in that general sense.
And I think you've got to hand it to Merrill Rupel. He really started seriously getting exhibits and acquiring art too, that covered a whole range of international kinds of art. I mean, he was very interested in Asian art and pre-Columbian art, and that's when we started collecting pre-Columbian. You know, he also oversaw the expansion and renovation of the old museum. I mean, Merrill, he was not necessarily popular, wouldn't you say that was fair? A number of people just didn't get on his wavelength. But I think objectively, he did a lot for the museum, that he really moved it into the modern world. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
I mean, significantly, so that if we are an important art institution now, I think it goes back pretty clearly to Merrill Rupel.
Did you two go to galleries? What were the you mentioned how the galleries benefited from this kind of coverage, the merger. And I'm wondering what was the gallery scene like in Dallas at that time? or local artist scene too?
Not very much in vision.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot. I'd say you'd have to look to the 70s before you're really talking about a significant gallery scene here. Is the way I dimly remember it. But I think that's another reason why what Rupel did in getting, a pretty important and diverse range of different kinds of art exhibits, with a lot of loans from dealers and other museums and collectors and things, that offered an opportunity, if you were really interested in art, to see all kinds of significant art without necessarily having to have big dealers, or any dealers at all in a lot of cases.
And Alan, your mother went on to become the first president for the Foundation for the Arts, is that correct?
Yes.
And that's a position that is served for life, or how does that work exactly?
She had that position for a good many years.
Then did you fill in at some point? Did you become a member of the Foundation for the Arts board?
Yes. I was the lawyer. Somebody had to do the work.
But don't you think it's fair to say that the foundation board has been, ever since it was set up, sort of the families of founding members of the foundation?
It has turned out that way, yes.
Yeah.
Not consciously or deliberately, but there is a tradition that if you were involved in what was a difficult combination, you bring a certain amount of wisdom to go with it. And it's a reason to continue whatever tradition you can bring together. But there's still a feeling among foundation members that it was important to set apart from city politics and focus on art in the broader sense. And I think that's still the prevailing view.
Were you or your mother on the board of the Foundation for the Arts when the O'Hara bequest came into the foundation?
Yes.
Was that as controversial as some people like to say it was?
I never thought that was very controversial. Maybe I was missing. There was a litigation over it.
Gosh, you got me. And I remember the O'Hara bequest, and Harry encouraging Pep O'Hara, but I didn't realize it was controversial. Why was it controversial?
Oh, there's a certain group of people in Dallas who came together and called themselves something, Friends of Contemporary Art or something like that, and argue that it should have gone to the museum in general and not to a
I do remember that. And I remember Harry Parker yes. But to be frank, this one, since as you will have gathered, the problems with both museums and the merged museum was money, does one quibble with a very, very generous bequest, which is still the largest funding for the Foundation for the Arts? I mean, come on. I do remember Harry Parker saying, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth, more or less. I don't think that was his words, but that's what he meant.
Right. So Anne, I was going through one of the transcripts of an interview you gave about 10 years ago, and you mentioned that you were really interested in starting a film series at the DMFA.
did.
Yes, and you ended up doing it. And I was wondering if you were at all influenced by the film series that Major and Downing Thomas had started at the Contemporary Museum. Did you?
Not exactly. I think it was, first of all, Major and Donnie Thomas were very close friends of ours. For as long as I can remember. In fact, Donnie designed he first designed the remodel of our kitchen, the first remodeling we did of this house, and then he designed and had built the outdoor library building. I think we just both love movies. Driving home from the state fair the other evening past the site of the old Coronet. You're probably too young to remember the Coronet.
I've heard that there used to be art exhibits at the Coronet Theater.
Yeah, and they showed art. That was the first theater in town that showed only art films, including a whole lot of foreign films. And I certainly found that revolutionary. I think it's just that Major and Donnie and we just like films. I certainly just basically like films, but it did seem like, well, back up. The reason I went to work at the museum was Harry Parker had been Tom Hoving's head of education at the Met when Hoving was director, and came to Dallas and was appalled that there was no education department in capital letters at DMA, so DMFA as it was then, and he had heard me give a lecture, I believe, about when the museum, shortly after the museum acquired the Roman figure of a woman. And I guess he thought I was a chatty lecturer or something. Anyway, he was, it's somebody soliciting money. Back in a minute, sorry.
What was the Coronet Theater?
Yeah, where was the Coronet Theater?
Fair Park area, or?
No, it was halfway between there and North Dallas.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Where were we? Somebody soliciting money.
We're wondering where the
Park.
Coronet Theater
Oh
was.
yeah, we were.
Oh,
We were-
yeah,
while you were
okay.
away, we were
So
wondering about
anyway, the Coronet Theater showed art films forever, and Harry's dictate to me when he hired me to create an education department was it needs to be just like the Met. So, right. And the film series was my idea, but he was all for that. And he said, yes, and you ought to have theater and readings and other things like that too. So I got several of my friends from the theater center days to come and give readings of books, which is actually in anticipation of Arts and Letters Live now. And that was very popular. And we tried all kinds of things. But that was, Harry saying, you want to have an ambitious education program. And expand the docent program, and which hitherto had been the only way you could become a docent at the museum was through the Junior League. Where did I put well, afterwards I'll give you a parody docent application
Is it
form.
the diploma?
Do you have that? No, the diploma was, no, the
Parody
diploma was
docent
funny. I don't want a copy of the diploma because I couldn't find it. Oh, this
You
is
can have a copy, but maybe
okay, but
you have to
there
describe
are
it
two
for
copies.
us
What did I
because
do?
it's so
There are two
funny.
copies of the application form, which struck me, even if I did do it long ago, as hysterical. I'll give you before you leave.
Okay.
I'll give you a copy. Anyway, it was it was inspired the comic application form by the fact that Harry said, we need to open it up to anybody that's interested in being a docent and not just the Junior League.
Right.
And speaking of families that supported the Contemporary Museum and the merger, Shirley Pollitt said, when she became a docent, said how irritated she was that, you had to belong to the Junior League, which was so Dallas, it was upper crust and okay.
Yeah.
The people that I accepted in the docent program didn't want to be upper crust and okay. Very lively group of people, still are for that matter. But the film program, you know, expanding and energizing the docent program, all of that. Actually, I started Go Van Go.
Right.
And somebody gave a bus to the museum. The first
Wow.
Go Van Go bus.
A full-on bus?
Uh-huh.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
didn't it become the minivan
Yeah.
named
right.
after Stanley? Was it Stanley's wife? First wife?
I
Stanley
don't remember.
Marcus's?
Literally, the first bus said Go Van Go.
Uh-huh.
The Marcus, Stanley and Billy, his first wife, did give money toward it. But
Uh-huh.
I thought it was named after somebody else who gave a bunch of money toward the program.
I can't
I
just
remember.
remember seeing in your interview that you mentioned minivan and it was a play on words because at the time it was a minivan.
Was Minnie Marcus his mother?
That's what it was.
Ah.
Yes.
That's
Yeah,
what
Minnie
it was.
Marcus was Stanley's mother.
Hmm.
Could be. I must say I do remember Go Van Go, naming it Go Van Go, but the rest of it just sort of eludes me. But it was a very fun period, and actually Gail Davitt, who's just retired as head of education, was an intern in education in the old museum. She started out
Wow.
that way and was very talented and stayed at the museum for the rest of her career.
Can you talk a little bit about in the 1980s, the early 1980s, when the education department collaborated with the SMU studio art department and brought in artists?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when I was running education, I was very interested, not just studio art, but interested in interaction between the museum education programs and local universities. And in fact, we gave a party every year for university art professors, which was, as far as I could tell, the first time that people at the art museum had really made an effort to reach out to art professors of all kind and art teachers. And that, so Mary Vernon in the studio art program at SMU was very interested in interaction with the art museum, and we did a lot of things with them. And
I think I read somewhere that you have artists doing painting demonstrations.
oh yeah, we did a lot of that.
With like-
And we had studio classes. Well, this was Harry, I've got to say. Also, he was very imaginative. He was behind the first education area in the new museum. He was responsible for finally realizing what I had thought about as being one of the impetuses for the merger, which was to get the museum out of Fair Park. And it was Harry who actually achieved that. And had, you know, the bond issue and raising the money to build a new museum downtown. And part of his deal was that there would be a big upfront education space, what is now the CCC, but it started out, I think we called it the Gateway Gallery. And I remember very clearly Ed Barnes, whose interests were not along those lines, and Harry saying, Ed, the education gallery has to be up front, and Barnes muttering, that's a revolting idea. And my recollection is that where Ed Barnes wanted it to be, the education area to be originally, was way out at the far end of the courtyard at Ross and St. Paul where nobody would see it. But Harry sat on that idea.
If Barnes could see it today.
Yeah, right. And I remember when the Fleischner Courtyard was built too, you know, and Harry insisted that that be for educational purposes and part of the education area. And Fleischner didn't exactly sneer, but he wasn't exactly enthusiastic either. But, you know, there are always, you have to have energy and direction from the top for things like that to happen.
Alan, did you continue kind of carrying the torch for exploration and art like your parents had done?
Yes. It was very easy to do. They were already into it.
What are some of the things that you've been into lately?
In recent years, I suspect with Anne's encouragement, I've been more involved in Asian art and have found that extremely fascinating. That's not exactly the way my parents' taste developed. They became more entranced with what was going on in Europe in the 2000s and maybe in the late 1930s. But that's an ongoing preoccupation, as you can tell from, if you look around this house.
Well, in case you need any other evidence that Alan and I were kind of designed for each other as soulmates, I said this to somebody recently, wondering why we'd gone to Burma for the second time after a 40-year gap. But, you know, I keep thinking, how many husbands, if their wife says airily, hey, let's go to Javan, Bali, or how about Ladakh, or maybe South India, or Central Asia? And Alan says, yes, and we immediately start making the plans and go. We think so much the same way we don't even really have to discuss it. We sort of look at each other and say, what do you think would be fun to do next if we do it?
A large part of that is the imagination of what you can see.
Yeah.
What people do in different parts of the world as they approach things from very different points of view.
Do you think your world travels have allowed you to see Dallas from a fresh perspective throughout the years?
I would say we had a, shall we say, critical and judicious view of our native town all the way along.
We've always tried to evaluate it objectively.
And improve it if possible, right?
Yes.
Did you notice differences in attitudes over the years?
Yes, certainly
Yeah.
become a much more expansive view of what the world is and how Dallas relates to it.
Well, talking about higher education, though, I mean, you've got to say that the universities and colleges in this area have really changed, including SMU, and currently UNT and so on. Well, and UD and UTD and Arlington have changed literally out of recognition since we were young. I mean, they are far more sophisticated and better institutions of higher education. And, you know, you can tell just from our new head conservator's first efforts to work with local universities, what a rich series of opportunities there are. That just wasn't true 50 years ago, right?
All too true.
Yeah, just like there wasn't an art history department at SMU, and now there is. I mean, that's a pretty simple and straightforward example. But all of the universities in this area are far more impressive than they used to be. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, it's richer. The two things are Dallas is richer. The two things may be related, but also just culturally and intellectually, Dallas has changed a great deal.
Do you think there was any major turning point that caused this kind of shift, or has it just been something that has gradually occurred over the years?
It's gradual, but I think it's the influx of people from elsewhere, particularly the East Coast. You know, when we were young, Dallas was a really small town almost. You could hardly call it a city. And from the 60s on, hotshot people with great educations and ambitions who wanted to become rich moved to Dallas. and have changed the city very significantly, wouldn't you say?
Of course,
Right.
very productively.
And you mentioned that in the 70s is when the Dallas gallery scenes really picked up. Was that because of this kind of influx in people, or do you think
And money.
And money.
I mean, it's just a much wealthier city full of much wealthier people. Try to imagine the fact that in 1950 North Dallas did not exist, that Lover's Lane was literally Lover's Lane, that the roads were, I know this is hard to imagine, but it's true, that the roads were not paved north of Lover's Lane.
Wow.
Right.
I've seen it.
And think, just start out downtown and don't go on an expressway. Drive out Preston Road. Just drive out Preston Road, way to hell and gone forever. And you've seen what happened to Dallas in the last 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
Changed out of recognition. And that's, the influx of lots and lots of people from somewhere else. All of whom are, not all of whom, but a lot of whom were, bright, gung-ho to become rich. Interested in culture as a way of showing off they're rich. And people who are genuinely, seriously interested in the arts and culture too, which is important.
Well, I don't have any other questions for you. We can keep going though. I'm wondering, I still am curious to get a sense of the merger and the atmosphere. Were there, because I've read there are people who just wouldn't even go into the Dallas Museum in Fair Park after the merger because of their negative feelings about the merger.
I don't recall it that way. There were a lot of people who didn't think we needed a combined museum. And there were some local artists who felt that the combination of the merger was hostile to them. And it certainly wasn't supportive of them. But I don't think that they were so numerous that you could say they represented any particular community point of view.
Yeah, I just don't think that's true because I can remember like going to the museum balls, what's now the Art Ball, in the late 60s and early 70s under Rupel. And those were the basic people who supported the art museum and continued to support it. And I think there were eventually some problems because I guess Rupel's personality rubbed people the wrong way. But even that seems to me to have been in most people's mind who did go to the museum, overridden by the fact that he was getting all this great art, and doing great exhibits and expanding the museum, starting the restaurant going, I mean, things were, I think in most people's minds, well, I mean, Margaret McDermott is certainly a good example. I mean, she was pro-Jerry and the old museum, but she accepted the merger, and she and Gene, when he was alive, continued to support the museum.
Speaking of difficult museum directors, what was McHagee's relationship to the board at the DMCA?
A little tense, I would say, because he was more enthusiastic in his visions and was a pretty good salesman in spreading those out. But there were people on the board who thought he was too vigorous, and they were just more stand paddish people. And McKay did irritate some of them, but I don't think there was any great hostility or antipathy. I think he was generally respected for the work he had done. And then when he left, there was enthusiasm to find a new but not entirely different kind of personality to run the museum.
Were you at the Klaus Oldenburg happening at the Dallas Museum for Contemporary Arts when the police showed up due to noise?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, darn.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Well, Ted, I'll tell you how I think you ought to end up. Can you move
Sure.
your camera?
Absolutely.
I really do think you should get a picture of Alan with 2 or 3 of his parents' contemporary
Yeah.
sculptures. And,
Where are they?
well, let me think what would probably...
With the Maxwell.
Yeah, Alan's
Oh, that's the
parents were
Maxwell, yeah.
not alone.
Very cool.
in
It's a great piece.
collecting what was then contemporary art. And actually, his parents were a couple of founders of Dallas Print and Drawing Society, and were big collectors of prints, and ultimately their print collection, except for the handful we have here, came to the museum. Yeah. I mean, that's what the people who founded the Museum for Contemporary Art were like, and why they founded it. You know, they were just gung-ho collectors of contemporary art and felt it didn't have a home in the old museum, which it didn't. So I think that's what, to me, that's what they really accomplished, and the merger helped, because that meant now you had one museum which for the first time really had a collection of contemporary art, modern art, whatever they called it back then.
Well, it was contemporary back then.
It was contemporary, yeah.
Exactly. Get by itself. I told you you look like Jehovah.
There you go. Oh, I love it. Yeah, we'll get a still off of here and I'll send it to you. It's so cool.